to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Washington handed the American government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with America.
War didn't break out between Britain and America in the 1930s. But there were times when we came closer than you might imagine, as American journalist Peter Carlson was to discover. He was on a visit to the American National Archive in Washington, D.C., when he found himself entering a strange and unsettling world.
I was a reporter for the Washington Post, and I was here at the archives, and I was introduced to a gentleman named Mr. Taylor, who had been working at the archives for 60 years. So you're introduced to somebody, you make small talk. I said, well, what's the weirdest document you've seen in your 60 years here? And he didn't think for a minute. He immediately said, War Plan Red.
Lying untouched for years, Plan Red contains detailed preparations for a massive war between America and the British Empire.
Joint Army and Navy Basic War Plan Red. This is our baby.
It shows where they would fight, what troops would be needed, and how the battles would unfold.
Okay, the red situation.
Throughout the plan, the Americans refer to themselves as blue, while the British are red.
On page 5, we've got national characteristics. The red race is essentially homogeneous, more or less phlegmatic, but I love that word, but determined and persistent when committed to a policy, and is noted for its ability to fight to a finish. I think that's a compliment, I'm not sure.
Phlegmatic Britain may have been, but they must have been doing something right. The British Empire at the beginning of the 20th century was the greatest the world had ever seen. But this did cause some resentment. We now think of Britain and America as having a special relationship. After all, they did fight side by side in 2 world wars. But at the start of the 20th century, the 2 countries had been at each other's throats for well over 100 years, and much of the fighting had taken place in the British Dominion of Canada.
It's important to remember that the United States was born out of a revolutionary struggle against Britain. Our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, is about how Americans successfully defended Baltimore against a British assault.
The first great conflict was the American War of Independence, which began in 1776. But the hostilities didn't end there. In fact, you could say that was only the beginning.
Then after that, there was the fabled American invasion of Canada in 1812.
There was another fracas in 1839 called the Arrowroot Wars.
There was a real war scare in the fall of 1862. Britain mobilized its full contingency force of over 20,000 regulars and brought them to Canada within a couple of weeks.
Then we had the Fenian invasion in 1866. This was about 800 Irish Americans who tried to invade Canada, thinking this might frighten the British into liberating Ireland.
Several hundred of them, I think as many as 600, launched a mini invasion from the New York area into Canada.
And you could say that was probably the last time that things got incredibly sticky. But we're now talking, over 125 years of pretty tricky Anglo-American relations.
Even during World War I, the 2 were not the cozy allies of popular memory. America resisted entry into the war until 1917, and even then fought as an associated power rather than as a full ally of the British. After the armistice, mistrust turned to bitterness.
After the war, there's a question, of course, then of who owes what money. and the Allies renege on repaying Britain their share of the debt, which leaves Great Britain really holding the bag in terms of the £9 billion that it owes the United States.
The U.S. was not being helpful. The U.S. was still demanding that Britain repay all of the loans that the U.S. had made to Britain. And the British would say, no, let us get the money that's owed to us that we loaned out to France and all these other states.
The demand that the United States made that war debts be repaid created a terrible image of the United States in Britain. Meanwhile, in the United States, the British desire to have war debts canceled created an image of Britain being ungrateful and not understanding what their obligations were to pay their debts.
So the relationship between the two countries in the 1920s was far from good. In Part 2, we will see how, as the 1930s started, the Great Depression and the rise of political extremism made people on both sides of the Atlantic think war between the two countries may not be far away. The existence of an American plan, written in 1930, for war against the British Empire, now seems shocking. But America and Britain had been at each other's throats for much of the 19th century, and because of the land border with America, the British Dominion of Canada was where the two countries tended to come to blows. On the Canadian side of the border, you can still find places like Fort Henry, built by the British to deter American aggression. What is incredible is that preparations for war against the British Empire were still taking place just across the border well into the 20th century. This is Fort Drum, one of the largest army bases in the USA. If you want to start a war with the British Empire, this is the place to do it from.
We sit right on the edge of Canada. Our ranges go up to within a couple miles of Canada. If you were to hit the interstate, which is just a couple miles outside of Fort Drum, you can get to Canada within 30-35 minutes. It is the perfect place for training for this type of war.
Shockingly, back in 1935, it looked as if this was exactly what the American military were preparing for. As the ink was still drying on War Plan Red, the American Army conducted the largest maneuvers in their history right here at one of the key strategic jumping-off points described in the plan.
The 1935 peacetime maneuvers was the largest attempt by the U.S. Army ever to bring that many forces together into one place. When you bring that many people onto the battlefield, what is it going to take to feed them, equip them, house them? How are you going to be able to move an entire division from the bivouac onto the battlefield? And these are all the things that they tested here.
Heavily camouflaged, extensive munition dumps were maintained by the Ordnance Department.
Why was America so threatened by Britain they would go into detailed preparations for an attack on her empire? To understand this, you need to look at relations between the two countries around the time America started work on Plan Red. Ironically, it was an arms control conference that sparked major problems.
As the 1920s proceed, things are reasonable, but then they go into a pretty steep decline after the Geneva talks in 1927, again dealing with naval power. There's a big dispute between the British and the American over cruisers.
Then there's a little thing called the British Navy. From 1588, when it licked the Spanish Armada, the greatest battle fleet in the world.
An arms control negotiating process highlights the tensions and conflict. So what is a process that's meant to move away from thinking about war and away from armaments and away from possible confrontation, actually in the context of the negotiation might highlight the differences and the antagonisms and frustrations.
The talks go very badly, and at that point, it's at that point and the immediate aftermath of the 1927 talks that there is conversation in Britain among leading ministers about the idea that war is not inconceivable with the United States. Even Churchill says, people say that it's inconceivable, but of course we all know that it's not.
To persevere against them.
So for Churchill, it's not that war is likely, but it's that war is certainly a possibility if we get ourselves into a position where the Americans can feel that they can push us around whenever they want to.
It was against this backdrop that the military started work on the plan. They were well aware of what an incendiary document Plan Red could be. One of their army chiefs described it as amongst the most closely guarded documents on Earth. It was therefore all the more amazing that they made a series of incredible blunders that let the world know what they were up to.
The construction of many new airfields was necessary in order to accommodate the large numbers of planes required for the extensive operations.
The war plan leaked out many times. In February 1935, there were hearings to build these secret air bases. The section of the hearing that was in secret, this was supposed to have been redacted as a secret testimony, but the government printers published the whole transcript. It's on the front page of the New York Times, May 1, May 2, 1935, that U.S. has budgeted money to build 3 air bases on the Canadian border, one to be camouflaged for the purposes of surprise attacks on Canada.
Portable landing mats make a firm landing area through which, in time, grass will grow, camouflaging the field from aerial vision.
When President Roosevelt saw the newspaper stories, he was furious, but mainly because news of the secret hearings had leaked out. He told the British and Canadians there was nothing to worry about, but it was hard to hide the fact that many in America would have liked nothing better than a showdown with Britain and her empire.
Press opinion on the whole was pretty nationalist, and each side was raking the other over the coals. And of course, newspapers are very important, both for stoking public opinion, but also sort of representing public opinion. The East Coast generally is, I mean, in this period they've become slightly Anglophobic, but on the whole, the East Coast are kind of pro-British. Middle America is very anti-British. The West Coast is anti-British. The South is ambivalent. But certainly in mid-America, in Chicago, and all of these places, and the Chicago Tribune is owned by a man named McCormick, Irish-American, hates the English.
America felt that, Britain would throw the U.S. under the bus in order to stay number one. And that would take the form of preventing the U.S. from engaging fully in foreign trade or having access fully to all the world's resources. And so there was a sense that somehow the British were a cynical and devious and manipulative power.
Faced with such a dastardly foe, the Americans were happy to contemplate any measure to keep the British at bay.
This is very interesting. A little addendum added, a piece of paper pasted on the top, written all in caps, number 11.